Welcome to the deep dive. We're here again to cut through the noise, give you those essential insights.
And today, we're digging into something pretty significant. The Los Angeles immigration raids. Specifically, the ones on June 6, 2025.
That's right. And our source for this deep dive, the only one we're using today, is an article titled The Los Angeles Immigration Raids, a critical examination of civil liberties and executive power.
So everything comes from that analysis.
Exactly. Our mission, as always, is to unpack what this article says, understand the different viewpoints it presents, and really explore the implications it discusses for civil liberties and executive power. Also, you can get a clearer picture of this complex situation.
And this article, it jumps right in, identifying the key federal players. We're talking ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the FBI, and the DEA, too.
And it gets specific about locations, doesn't it? Mentioning various Home Depot stores and a clothing warehouse.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But importantly, the article makes it clear right from the start that it doesn't see this as just some isolated thing. It actually frames these raids as, part of a much bigger picture, a continuation of policies seen during the Trump administration. Puts it in that national context.
Okay, right. So let's dive into that first section. What actually happened? How did these raids go down on June 6th, according to this article? The tactics, the execution.
Well, the article details some pretty striking tactics. It talks about the use of armored vehicles.
Armored vehicles.
Yeah. And the piece notes, this wasn't just about, keeping officers safe. It argues it projected this really strong, maybe even intimidating presence. It mentions how vehicles like that can evoke fear.
So more than just transport, it was a statement in a way.
That's how the article seems to frame it, yeah. It also talks about crowd control measures being implemented. Clearly, according to the piece, the agencies were expecting protests.
Preparing for backlash.
Right. Setting up barricades, placing officers strategically, that kind of thing.
And didn't the article mention riot gear as well?
It did. Describing personnel in riot gear as indicating, and this is the article's phrasing, an unwavering stance against dissent, signaling they were ready for opposition.
Wow. That paints a very forceful picture. What about the arrests? What does the article say happened afterwards?
So the piece notes arrests targeted undocumented individuals, obviously, but also, and this is key according to the analysis, public figures.
Public figures.
Yes. And the article specifically highlights the arrest of a prominent union leader.
I remember reading that in the source. The article really emphasizes how that particular arrest sparked widespread outrage, didn't it?
Absolutely. It says it really pushed the discussion about civil liberties into the spotlight.
So the article connects the tactics, the armored vehicles, the riot gear, and these high-profile arrests.
Exactly. It presents these choices as sort of showcasing specific enforcement methods in tech. And crucially, the article argues that these actions really push the envelope, straddling that line between lawful enforcement and maybe infringing on personal freedoms, raising big questions about power dynamics.
Okay, that makes sense. High-profile arrest plus that intense visual. Yeah, you can see how that would provoke a strong reaction. Which leads us right into the community response. How did people in LA react, according to this piece?
The article describes it as immediate and pretty massive, a huge wave of protests. It mentions groups like Curla, the Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, were spearheading a lot of it.
And the piece frames these protests. What was the feeling behind them? Fear?
Anger. Both, definitely. The article says they reflected this really palpable fear, but also anger. Anger at what was seen as aggressive overreach, a feeling that basic civil liberties were threatened.
So spontaneous gatherings, people sharing stories.
Yeah, the article talks about impromptu meetings, people voicing discontent, sharing very personal stories about the disruption, the emotional turmoil these raids caused families.
The article also seemed to stress the psychological impact, didn't it?
It really did, pointing out that the fear of deportation is just always there for many families. And the source suggests that the perceived normalization of raids like this, it just intensified everything, created this climate of constant anxiety.
Were there broader calls coming from community leaders, as the article describes, beyond the immediate protests?
Yeah, this piece highlights that leaders were looking at the bigger picture, too, talking about the economic fallout, the social repercussions.
Like disrupting businesses?
Disrupting businesses, yeah. But also just creating this climate of fear that the article says really damages social cohesion, the trust that holds a city together.
And did the article identify a specific demand coming out of all this?
It did. It underscores that the need for comprehensive immigration reform became this really central, pressing demand. Communities rallying, the article says, for more humane treatment, trying to reclaim their own narrative, and finding resilience, unity.
It's clear from this analysis, then, that the community reaction was swift, strong, and deeply felt. Okay, let's pivot, like the article does, to the official reactions. City Hall, the state. How did they respond based on this source?
The article goes into responses from key figures, Mayor Karen Bass and Governor Gavin Newsom. It says both expressed pretty grave concerns.
About what specifically?
Mainly about the implications for community safety and, again, civil liberties.
And Mayor Bass's reaction, according to the piece.
The article states she condemned the raids, said they created a climate of fear, undermined public safety, and really threatened LA's values of inclusivity and cohesion. Strong words.
And Governor Newsom, what did the article say about his response?
This analysis notes Newsom also disapproved, arguing that these kinds of raids could seriously damage the relationship between local law enforcement and residents.
Residents who might otherwise cooperate with police.
Exactly. The article highlights how Newsom's comments, as presented, linked that perception of safety for everyone to the integrity of local government and just basic community trust.
So it sounds like both leaders, as the article portrays them, were calling for more balance.
Yes, the article says they advocated for policies that could, respect homeland security needs, but also protect civil rights, urging an approach that doesn't look like it's disproportionately targeting people just based on their status. Their comments, according to the piece, really underscored this commitment to dignity and justice.
What about the LAPD? The article touches on their role, too.
Yeah, this piece describes the LAPD as being in a really tough spot, navigating this precarious position during the protests.
How so?
Well, they had to maintain order, obviously, but also ensure the rights of the demonstrators were protected. The article uses this to illustrate just how complex things get when local police operations intersect with federal immigration enforcement.
Right, so local officials, based on this article, largely critical and worried about the impact on the city and its people. Now, the article then zooms out, right? Puts these LA raids into a broader context. How does it connect them to larger patterns, especially under the Trump administration?
Yet, this context is crucial in the article's analysis. It describes a really significant shift during the Trump presidency, an intensified focus, it says, on deportation efforts.
And it mentions specific policies that enabled this.
It does. It points to things like expedited removals, explaining that these allowed for much quicker expulsions, often without a full hearing. And this, the article argues, expanded the pool of who could be targeted way beyond just individuals with serious criminal records.
The article also notes a specific focus on cities like Los Angeles.
That's right. The piece states that federal operations were visibly ramped up in urban areas. This led to, a much more pronounced ICE presence and significantly more arrests happening out in public, not just at detention centers.
And the impact of that, according to the article,
triggered widespread fear. The article notes people became really anxious about their safety, their rights, even just going about their daily lives in public.
The piece also discusses efforts back then to get state and local police more involved in immigration enforcement.
It does. The article explains that Trump's executive orders actively pushed for this cooperation. And this, the source says, led to what it terms entangled law enforcement.
Meaning local police helping ICE?
Essentially, yeah. Situations where local police were incentivized, sometimes maybe even pressured, the article suggests, to assist federal immigration operations.
And the article is clear that this cooperation drew a lot of fire.
Oh, absolutely. The article highlights criticism from civil rights advocates mentioned in the source. They argued, it says, that this entanglement jeopardized civil liberties, could foster racial profiling, and that it really escalated tensions, leading directly to protests and backlash.
So this article presents the LA raids not as something totally new, but as, emblematic of that larger trend, that systematic approach from the previous administration.
Precisely. According to this analysis, you really got to understand that broader history to get the full weight of what happened in LA and its implications for civil liberties and executive power, which the article really digs into next.
Right, which brings us squarely to the core of this article's critique, civil liberties. What were the main concerns raised by groups like the ACLU, as discussed in this piece?
This article details pretty significant scrutiny from organizations like the ACLU. Their main worry, it says, was that these raids infringed on really fundamental liberties, things like due process, protection against unreasonable searches.
And the article mentions that fear factor again, that these actions created a climate of fear.
Yes, it emphasizes that this fear was especially intense in immigrant communities, causing this deep anxiety about safety and legal rights.
What about the specific legal arguments the article brings up?
The piece highlights arguments from legal experts and advocates. They contended, it says, that the raids often bypass crucial legal safeguards. Safeguards under the Constitution that apply to everyone, citizens or not.
Like the Fourth Amendment.
Exactly. Protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The argument highlighted in the article is that arbitrary detentions, maybe without enough evidence or probable cause, really put that principle at risk.
The article also talks about the potential damage to trust between communities and police. Right?
That's a major point raised by critics in this piece. The claim is that actions like these can severely erode that trust. And the article notes the potential consequence, a chilling effect.
Meaning people become afraid to interact with authorities at all.
Right. Less likely to report crimes, less likely to cooperate with investigations because they fear any contact could lead to immigration problems for themselves or their families.
Does the article mention any broader concerns about democracy itself?
It touches on that. The source mentions apprehension from some critics about a potential drift towards a more authoritarian style of governance if executive power and enforcement isn't properly checked by legal protections.
And what's the article's emphasis regarding transparency and accountability here?
The article highlights how strongly groups like the ACLU, as presented in the source, stress the need for transparency and accountability in government actions, especially in sensitive areas like immigration enforcement.
So the overall legal viewpoint highlighted in the piece is?
This source really underscores that, legally speaking, protecting civil liberties during immigration enforcement isn't just like a nice-to-have, it's essential. It's about ensuring the rule of law doesn't get overridden by arbitrary power.
Okay, so this article positions the raids as this critical flashpoint, really sharpening the focus on that ongoing tension between security goals and protecting individual rights.
Exactly. It frames the whole conversation around these raids as showing why we need, constant vigilance and advocacy to uphold constitutional rights for everybody, whatever their immigration status.
All right, let's shift to looking ahead now. Beyond the immediate aftermath, what long-term impacts does this article discuss?
This piece outlines several pretty profound, lasting effects. A big one is just the cultivation of this persistent environment of fear within immigrant communities.
And it talks about families specifically.
Absolutely. The article mentions the real possibility of families being fragmented, torn apart by detention or deportation, or even just the constant fear of it. And it notes this anxiety isn't just emotional.
How so?
It can actually stop people from seeking essential services. Things like healthcare, education for their kids. They might avoid any official interaction out of fear their status will be revealed.
The article also really digs into how these events change the dynamic between local police and immigrant communities, doesn't it?
It highlights this as a major area of long-term damage, a potential breakdown of trust. The article argues that if people perceive local police as working hand-in-glove with federal immigration enforcement,
they're less likely to cooperate.
Significantly less likely, the article suggests. Less likely to report crimes they witness, less likely to serve as witnesses, less likely to cooperate in investigations, fear for themselves, fear for their families.
And the article connects this breakdown of trust to wider public safety concerns.
It does. It suggests this creates a kind of vicious cycle. Immigrant communities become more isolated, more vulnerable, which counterintuitively can make everyone less safe. And the article notes this also creates huge challenges for local governments trying to maintain cohesion and safety.
How does it impact local governance directly, according to the source?
The article says the impact is pretty significant. As cities deal with these consequences, you often see a push for things like sanctuary policies, local rules trying to shield immigrants.
Which then sparks debate.
Exactly. Wider debates about how public money is spent, what local priorities should be. The article says local leaders are kind of forced to re-examine their roles, their relationships with residents, and with federal agencies.
How does the article tie all these long-term effects back to the national conversation on immigration reform?
The article argues that seeing these intense federal actions clash with these strong local responses, it really shapes that national discourse. It suggests advocates and communities are pushing harder for a more, humane approach.
An approach that respects rights and contributions.
Yes, one that respects civil liberties but also explicitly recognizes the contributions immigrants make. That's the direction the push is heading, according to the analysis.
And the article's conclusion on this front is that these long-lasting ripples make the whole debate about civil liberties and executive power even more urgent.
That's the core takeaway from its look at the long-term impact, yeah.
Yeah.
These effects don't just disappear, they keep resonating.
Okay, finally, this article examines one more angle, the role of the media. How did different media outlets shape the understanding of these events, according to this piece, expert speaker? The article points out that you saw different narratives emerging. It suggests that mainstream media often frame the raids primarily through a lens of, say, national security or law enforcement, focusing on the government's justification. Expert speaker, yeah, emphasizing the government's stated role, its reasons for the raids. And the article argues this framing could potentially lead to a narrower view, maybe overlooking the personal stories, the human costs. And it contrasts this with other media approaches. Expert speaker, it does. It highlights how some independent media outlets, according to the source, really trying to present the human side, focusing on the fears, the challenges faced by immigrants, using interviews, personal accounts, expert speaker, exactly. The article notes they often use interviews with people directly impacted to try and build more empathetic understanding of the, well, traumatic consequences. The article also brings up social media's role, doesn't it? Expert speaker,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It points out how platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc. allowed for information to spread in real time during and after the raids, empowering grassroots groups. Expert speaker, that's what the article suggests, yeah. Empowering grassroots movements, community organizations to share their own perspectives, their experiences directly with the public. And the article sees this digital aspect as a potential counterbalance. Expert speaker, it does. Suggesting social media could challenge or add nuance to traditional media narratives that might sometimes, even unintentionally, perpetuate stereotypes or fear. By amplifying voices from the ground, it helped raise awareness and mobilize support for policy changes. So this article presents the media's role as pretty complex, influencing not just what people knew, but maybe how they felt about it too. Expert speakers.
Precisely.
The source underscores how crucial journalism, in all its forms, is for informing the public, but also for shaping empathy, arguing it's vital for a more complete discussion about these big issues of civil liberties and executive power.
Wow.
Okay, we've really unpacked a lot from this single article examining the LA immigration raids of June 6, 2025. We've looked at the tactics described, the powerful reactions from the community and officials, the historical context provided, those critical civil liberties questions raised, the long-term impacts discussed, and even how the media narrative was shaped, all according to this one source.
Yeah, this article really positions these raids as a vital case study, a lens through which to view these ongoing, really complex national debates about immigration, civil liberties, and the reach of executive power.
And it's crucial, as this analysis stresses, to understand the different viewpoints it presents, the concerns from critics about fear and targeting versus arguments for lawful order that might also be present.
And the article ends, or emphasizes throughout, this need for communities to engage, right? To advocate for policies that protect rights, but also address legitimate security concerns, and to foster a dialogue based on compassion, making sure affected voices are actually heard.
The source definitely concludes that in times where executive power might seem really strong, the role of advocacy groups, of local communities, becomes even more important, highlighting that need for strong legal protections, for transparency, and for constantly reevaluating policies to make sure civil rights are safeguarded.
It's a tough balance and an ongoing one.
Absolutely, and maybe this analysis leaves us, and you, with a final thought to chew on drawn from these themes. Given these intense tensions the article describes between national security needs and individual rights, and the deep impacts on communities and trust that it details, how might events like these continue to shape the future path of immigration policy and that whole ongoing conversation about the balance of power here in the United States?
A really important question to keep considering.
Indeed. Well, that's all for this deep dive. We hope exploring the source material has given you a clearer, more informed perspective on the significant event and its many complex implications.